So thanks again for coming. It's really great that you're here. So this is, as Joe said, this is the first event of a whole week of events that's going on with Christian Union. You've got the publicity in front of you. And the reason the Christian Union do these kind of events is because we really want to give you the opportunity to explore the Christian message for yourself. The Christian message, Christians call gospel. Gospel literally means good news. And it's good because Jesus of Nazareth ultimately shows us that ultimate reality behind everything is a God of love. So the reason you and I are here is not the result of some great cosmic accident that threw us into being. We're not here on the whim of some kind of omnipotent, all-powerful deity who made us with a flex of his muscles just because he can, but we're here because of the overflowing generosity, the overflowing creative generosity of a God of love. And if that's true, it changes everything. It means that life isn't about just surviving long enough to pass on our genes. It's not some great moral exam we've got to pass to somehow validate our existence. It's about living out our potential as people made by this God of love in order to know his love. It's a view of the world which gives us great dignity and purpose innate to us. And it means life is about enjoying this world and fulfilling our potential in it. So we really want you to explore this, and yet we're really aware that there's all kinds of really fundamental objections and suspicions that people have about this belief system, which I think can often just kind of mean we can close off this, even the possibility that it's true, and shut down our inquiries and our investigations before they start. And so we're wanting to run these lunch bars to try and address some of these questions and open up investigations once again. That's our hope, that's our aim. So that's why we're doing it. And the big question we're looking at today is this question that's of science and faith. Has science made faith, belief in God, redundant? And it's a really, really pervasive idea. So this guy's Peter Atkins. He's a chemist, and he's written lots. So he's a great popularizer of science. And he says this: science, the system of belief founded securely on publicly shared, reproducible knowledge, emerged from religion. And as science discarded its chrysalis to become its present butterfly, it took over the heath. So for Peter Atkins, religion had a role to play in our intellectual history, but that role has now been thoroughly superseded by science. And so like a butterfly emerging from this restrictive chrysalis into the bright light of day, we've now discarded that chrysalis and we're spread our wings like the beautiful enlightened butterflies we are because of the power of science. He goes on to say there is no reason to suppose that science cannot deal with every aspect of existence. Only the religious, among whom I include not only the prejudiced but the uninformed, hope there is a dark corner of the physical universe or of the universe of experience that science can never hope to illuminate. So an event like this, where we're trying to reassert the validity of religion for people like Peter Atkins, is a return to the Dark Ages. Because for Peter Atkins, science is exclusive in its ability to give us reliable knowledge of the world, it's publicly accessible, reproducible knowledge, and it is sufficient. It can give us this whole, fully orbed, completely satisfying view of the world, which renders religion unnecessary. And really they're the two claims that I want to address today. But first of all, just one other quote. This is James Watson. He's talking about religious scientists. He says, occasionally I meet them and I'm a bit embarrassed because I cannot believe anyone who accepts truth by revelation. So that obviously hurts me a little bit as a religious scientist. But I take comfort from the fact that there are other great scientists out there. So James Watson, of course, discovered the double helical structure of DNA. He went on to found the Human Genome Project. James Watson's successor, Francis Collins, who eventually saw its completion in 2003, he wrote shortly after that his kind of autobiography explaining how his development as a scientist, but also his conversion to Christianity. And he said, I had started this journey of intellectual exploration to confirm my atheism. That now lay in ruins as I was forced to admit the plausibility of the God hypothesis. So if nothing else, that should give us pause for thought. It's not quite as simple as people like Atkins and Watson would have us believe. This should, I think, interest us about this possibility of being someone who's thoroughly immersed in science, has a very scientific worldview, and yet has found themselves convinced by the plausibility of the Christian message. So this is really what I want us to explore a bit more. So a bit about my research. The great breakthrough in my area was this discovery of induced pluripotent stem cells. The term pluripotent, when referring to stem cells, describes the ability of stem cells to transform into all of the different cell types that make up our body. So when we're a few days old embryo, we're basically a little cluster of stem cells. These cells were indistinguishable from each other. They couldn't really do much at all. They could just divide and divide and divide. But they had this thing, this potential to become all of the other cells that would one day make up our adult bodies in all of their astonishing complexity. Now, that ability, that potential to become everything else is very quickly lost in stem cells. So as we develop, part of our development means this potential of stem cells becomes gradually restricted until as the cells specialize into the particular cell types they become: blood cells, brain cells, bone cells, etc. So that's a really important protection actually against cancer. But this guy, Shinya Yamanaka, he won a Nobel Prize for this, discovered that just by turning on 2 or 3 key genes in fully specialized cells, so cells from maybe your skin or the inside of your cheek, even cells that are washed out in your wee, you can recover old bladder cells from your wee that are still viable. You can grow them up in the lab. You can turn on these key genes and they start to look very much like stem cells, and in fact they are stem cells. They're cells that we're able to use to make all of the different tissues in our body. So one day you could wee in a pot, they could get those cells, they could turn on these genes, then they could specialize these cells to become, I don't know, dopamine producing neurons and use it to treat your Parkinson's. And the way we know this is the case is because of this chap here. This is a chimeric mouse, okay? And so the key experiment which demonstrated Yamanaka's work is when he took some of his cells, these are the cells here, these induced pluripotent stem cells, he injected them into a 3-day-old blastocyst. This little ball of cells here on the inside of the blastocyst is going to be the developing embryo, and these stem cells fuse with that blastocyst, you see. So these stem cells have a distinct genetic identity to these other cells, and then you see how the mouse develops, and what Yamanaka showed is that those cells would go on to contribute to all of the different tissues in the mouse. That's the proof. And so it's a really amazing discovery, but it's a very, very powerful demonstration. And it's things like this that give science such prestige in our culture, in our way of thinking. This is Richard Dawkins basically talking about that prestige. Science boosts its claim to truth by its spectacular ability to make matter and energy jump through hoops on command and to predict what will happen and when. So science has this astonishing capacity to give us reliable knowledge about the world. And it's because of that, lots of people say, actually, this is the only valid type of knowledge that we really have. And so what we've got to do is we've got to try and squeeze our understanding of ourselves into what we can find out through science, what we can find out through these very impressive experiments. This is Daniel Dennett, who's drawing this conclusion. He's talking about this mysterious thing called consciousness in our minds. And he says there is only one sort of stuff, namely matter, the physical stuff of physics, chemistry, and physiology. And we can, in principle, we're not there yet, but scientists are working on it, account for every mental phenomenon using the same physical principles, laws, and raw materials. So the hope of Dennett and Dawkins and people like that is that eventually we'll be able to account for everything using biology, chemistry, and physics. Because that's reliable knowledge. That's the real stuff where you can actually demonstrate through experiment. Now, in many ways, as we reflect on this, it seems intuitively unsatisfactory. So you get famous quotes like this. This is Francis Crick. He says, your joys, your sorrows, your memories, your ambitions, your sense of personal identity and free will are in fact no more, and that's the key phrase, no more than the behaviour of a vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules. So everything about you, the things that are most central to your identity as a human being, are actually not only explained in part by the mechanisms of biology, but in their totality. You are no more than the signalling of a vast assembly of nerve cells. This is Richard Dawkins talking about love. As a Christian interviewer, he's asked, when you think about your wife, what does love mean? Dawkins says, well, we've been into that before. It's an emotion which is a manifestation of brain stuff. Jesus said love is the purpose of life. Does that sound nonsense to you? It sounds like something grafted on, a superfluous excrescence on life which I feel I understand better. But it doesn't surprise me that brains, being what they are, have a capacity to invent spurious purposes of the universe. So for Richard Dawkins, love is nothing more than an emotion, nothing more than a manifestation of brain stuff. And though, as human beings, love feels important to us, it feels of central significance that love is part of who we are, our love for those we love is actually central to our identity, that's actually nothing real behind that. And to say that's important or central to your identity is actually to impose stuff on reality, so it's graft stuff on to an emotion which is just an emotion, a manifestation of brain stuff. To say love is of great significance is artificial. It's something we're reading into reality that's not really there. And the reason Dawkins adopts this, I think, rather stark view is because he's very committed to this program of explaining everything into the rather limited type of explanations available to us when we use biology, chemistry, and physics. But that's a kind of soft argument against that view. It doesn't seem to account for the richness of human experience and the centrality of important things like love to us. But there's a harder philosophical problem with this as well. And a clue to that's what he says in the last thing he says. It doesn't surprise me that brains, being what they are, have a capacity to invent spurious purposes of the universe. This is philosopher of science in California, Patricia Churchland. And she says this: boiled down to essentials, the principal chore of nervous systems is to get the body parts where they should be in order that the organism may survive. She's talking about what our brains are for. A fancier style of representing, that's kind of thinking, trying to understand the world, is advantageous so long as it is geared to the organism's way of life and enhances the organism's chances of survival. Truth, whatever that is, definitely takes the hindmost. Do you see what she's saying? She's saying the reason you and I have brains, the reason you and I think and try and make sense of the world is not to discover truth, is not to discover the way things really are. The reason we have brains is ultimately for no other reason than to survive, to get our body parts where they need to be in order to flee and fight and reproduce and feed. That's why we have brains. It might be useful to have true beliefs about the world, like we know it's not a good idea to go and stroke the lions and that kind of thing, but it's not essential. So we can believe all kinds of things that aren't true as long as they give us survival benefit. Religion, I suppose, is a case in point. We have religious beliefs because of their kind of evolutionary benefits. They give us kind of social cohesion and all that kind of stuff. But it's not a true belief. It's a false belief because our brains aren't there to give us true beliefs. Our brains are there simply to help us survive. But you see the problem. You see the problem. If we can't trust our brains, then we can't trust our brains, even when our brains tell us we can't trust our brains. The idea refutes itself. Someone who gets this and who kind of embraces it says, this is John Gray, he writes, modern humanism is the faith that through science humankind can know the truth and so be free. But if Darwin's theory of natural selection is true, I'd say all there is to say on the matter, this is impossible. The human mind serves evolutionary success, not truth. Now he basically says, and that's all there is to say on the matter. To talk of rationality is just pretentious as human beings. We're not reasonable, we're not rational. As he says, he wrote a book called The Silence of the Animals, saying we should basically take this kind of sub-rational silence of the animals and live without trying to say anything true. But the problem is, he's written a book on the matter. He's argued for that position. It's almost impossible to live consistently with us because we don't fit that idea of things. This is someone, not a believer, but much more circumspect about this. Raymond Tallis, he wrote a book called Aping Mankind. He says this biologistic image of humans effectively, it's a biologistic, like saying biology is all there is to say, effectively denies the centrality, even the possibility of precisely those unique capacities that have made humans able to theorise about evolution or to develop neuroscience. And this is the key point. If on the origin of the species really were the last word on humanity, it could not have been written. So this attempt to squeeze ourselves into only what can be said truly through the experimental method ultimately means we don't make sense to ourselves anymore. By censoring out anything not validated by an experiment, our human story becomes incoherent. It no longer makes sense. So we need to go beyond science. This is a theologian, ex-scientist, Cambridge physicist. He's talking about about the need to go beyond science, the limits of science. I am certainly someone who wants to take science seriously, but I also need to recognise that science has purchased its great success by the modesty of its ambition. It does not seek to ask and answer every kind of question that an inquiring mind might want to address. Instead, it confines itself to considering solely the processes by which things happen, without asking whether there is a meaning and purpose behind what is going on. Polkinghorne says the reason science is so successful is because it's modest in its ambitions. It only seeks to answer those kind of questions which you can actually get your hands on and do experiments on. But there are other questions. There are other questions that you can't address in that way. And it's not legitimate to say those questions aren't real. Those questions are real, but they're just questions we can't ask through the scientific method. Now, this is true. Whatever conclusion you ultimately reach, whenever you want to try and say anything about science and where it fits, you need to go beyond science to make sense of it. Just to illustrate this is Bertrand Russell. He says this: whatever knowledge is attainable must be attained by scientific methods, and what science cannot discover, mankind cannot know. Now, what's the problem with that statement? It's a statement of knowledge, isn't it? And it's also a statement that can't be verified by the scientific method. It's self-refuting. So we need to go beyond science. So this is the mistake. This is a boring but important book of philosophy of science. And this is what he says: if he be a man engaged in any important inquiry, he must have a method. Apparently women don't make this mistake. And he will be under a strong and constant temptation to make a metaphysics out of his method. That is, to suppose the universe ultimately of such a sort that his method must be appropriate and successful. He's saying it's a mistake to say, okay, I've got this really, really great method, and so what I'm going to do is try and squeeze my understanding of the world into what I can find out through this method. We learn this really, really early on. I've got my daughter. This is my oldest one when she was about 9 months old. Okay. When she was about this age, I'd be playing with my phone in front of her like a good father, and she'd want to reach out and grab my phone. And it'd be enough at that stage for me to simply take my phone and put it in my pocket, and she'd forget about it and move on to wanting something else she couldn't have. But a few months later, that no longer worked. She realised that just because she couldn't see something didn't mean it wasn't available for her to play with. She just needed to use a new method to get at it. She needed to tug on my sleeve to get access to it. Scientists learn this. It's no good saying, well, my telescope can only see so far, so what I'm going to try and do is kind of squeeze my understanding of the universe into what I can actually see through my telescope. No, scientists know they need to go and find out ways of seeing further. So how do we go about discovering purpose? This is a helpful quote by a philosopher theologian called Leslie Newbigin. He says this: cause can be discovered by science, but purpose cannot, because until the purpose has been realised, it is hidden in the mind of the one whose purpose it is. Newbigin sees that purpose is a personal thing. It's something that persons have, people who can look to the future and form desires and take steps to achieving those desires, set goals for themselves and work out the realisation of those goals. And as such, purpose is a hidden thing. Until the purpose is realised, it's in our minds, it's inside of us. He gives an image of a building site. So imagine you go to a building site and there's bricks stacked up here and there, and you look around and you decide there's some purpose to what's going on. How do you discover what that purpose is? You've got two choices. You can take the empirical approach. You can go back every single day and see what emerges from the rubble, whether it's an office block or a house or whatever. Or you can go and talk to the builder, the architect, and find out what the purpose is. And Newbigin says, when it comes to the purpose behind the universe, waiting to the end is not an option for us. We need to find the one whose purpose it is. The claim of Christianity is that God himself makes himself accessible to us. We saw, didn't we, that the reason for science's success ultimately is not the ingenuity or power of its methods, although they're vital, but the accessibility of its subject matter. Science deals with the stuff you can control, the stuff you can get your hands on and manipulate and prod and poke and see what happens when you take it apart. Science is experimental. That's why it's so successful, because you can do experiments. But that doesn't apply to everything. But this is the claim of Christianity, that God himself has made himself accessible to us. At the beginning of one of the early accounts of Jesus' life, John's Gospel, it says this. This is kind of prologue as he's introducing the person of Jesus of Nazareth. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things were made through him, and without him was not anything made that was made. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. That word is the Greek word logos. John's writing into a time where people generally believed there was a purpose behind the universe. And the purpose they called logos. It's the kind of ultimate reason for existence, this kind of harmonizing principle that makes sense of everything. And in those days, the good life, the highest form of life, was to kind of contemplate that reason, to try and work out what it was and live in conformity to it. That's how you lived a good, successful, happy, free life, by living out in harmony with the purpose of the universe. And then John says something remarkable. He says this: the Word, this reason behind everything, became flesh and dwelt among us. And we have seen his glory. Glory is of the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth. At the heart of Christianity is the claim that God himself comes and enters into our world and opens himself up to our scrutiny. He makes himself physically present and therefore knowable to us. It means that we can scrutinize this claim. At the heart of Christianity is the claim that God has entered into history. He's impacted lives in history. In fact, the writer Paul nails it down to one point. Jesus lived this life in the world. He impacted people's lives, but then he was hung up on a cross and was killed. At that moment in history, that was the definitive proof that Jesus was a fraud. For the Romans, to be crucified was the ultimate sign of being weak and powerless. For the Jews, to be hung up on a tree was the ultimate sign of being rejected by God. And yet Jesus claimed to be, in those terms, Messiah, this king. It was the proof that he had failed. There were dozens of other messiahs that had been crucified. Jesus was just to be numbered with one of them. But the claim of Christianity is that Jesus rose again from the dead. And Paul says, if that's not true, if it's not really the case that he rose from the dead, then we have all men most to be pitied. It's a historical claim that can be scrutinized. God opens himself up to our scrutiny. And it means that God is accessible not just to great philosophers or these self-disciplined mystics, or he's accessible to you. People like you and me can actually know him, because ultimate reality is encountered through a relationship. Now, I'm a scientist. I know that that could make us feel uncomfortable. As scientists, we're not people. But you see, if ultimate reality is not something, but someone, then the way you know someone is different. I'm married. I know that doing experiments on someone is not a good way of getting to know them. We could say, I'm only going to believe in stuff that you can prove to me by an experiment. But you just see, that's to decide the answer to your inquiry before you've even begun asking it. It's to kind of try and determine, tell the universe how it should be. If we reject that claim that God is one who has made himself available to us and wants to know us just on the basis that we'll only believe in stuff by doing experiments, it's ultimately not to be very scientific.